Hello, everyone, and welcome to our very first event in our New York City Reborn virtual summit. I'm Michael Hendricks, Director of State and Local Policy here at the Manhattan Institute. Today, I have the privilege in this first panel of speaking with three of my brilliant colleagues, Nicole Gelinas, Steve Malenga, and Ralph Mangual. I'll give them proper introductions in just a little bit, but following our conversation, please stay tuned. I'll be having a conversation with Jeff Cotlin of City and State to discuss the state of the mayoral race. Now, just as a bit of background and preview, the Manhattan Institute established a New York City Reborn campaign because our institution believes in the city, its people, and its promise. And that's also why we've just released our mayoral playbook, Policy Ideas. Please check them out. They're all ideas for the next mayor of New York City to help us restore growth and opportunity for everyone in the city. And it's why we're kicking off this week's week-long Ideas Summit. Post-coronavirus, the Manhattan Institute envisions a New York City with a thriving economy, healthy finances, accessible housing, effective infrastructure, pluralistic education, sustained public safety, and increasing competitiveness. It's a lot, but it's not impossible. We've done it before. And we see a diverse coalition of our neighbors who believe in sensible, rigorously thoughtful ideas for the flourishing of all New Yorkers. And we aim to give them a voice. New York City Reborn is a project to help turn that kind of a vision into reality. It's a project that over the past many months has been incorporating research, journalism, and events. This is part of that. And through this initiative, we've also been convening leaders from around the city with MI scholars to discuss issues central to the city's recovery. And that's also what we intend to spotlight right now, today, and throughout this week. The goal of this conversation that you're about to watch is to take stock of where New York City stands after a year-long pandemic. Of course, while it's not over yet, we appear to finally have the end in sight. It's amazing we've finally reached here. And to sketch out some potential paths for New York City as we prepare to head to the polls for the coming months. The toll the COVID-19 took in the city and its economy is just staggering. We'll dig into this a little bit more. But just in a few months, New York City lost thousands of small businesses alone. It took 1 in 8 jobs with them. Broadway shuttered its doors, Midtown offices and hotels empty. And the acute challenges of the pandemic also threw the city's pre-existing shortcomings into stark relief. The city had grown its budget and its workforce tremendously over Bill de Blasio's time in office. The state has serially punted reforming the MTA. And a new generations of politicians have been pushing a kind of a radical, new, even progressive agenda. So where do we go from here? We know that the city and state have pushed, the city and state, I should say, have received considerable funds from the federal government, but taxes are still being raised in high-income New Yorkers. And a population that fled the city during the pandemic, their return is not necessarily assured. 2020 also saw a steep rise in murders and shootings, the steepest since the 1990s. And the number of New Yorkers using public transportation remains stubbornly low. So we see the opportunity, but we also see the challenges. And I'm excited for our panel to weigh in on all of this and much more. As we have this conversation, please send us your questions on whatever platform you're watching us on, and I'll incorporate them into our discussion. All right, so let's get started. First up, Nicole Gelinas. She's a senior fellow and contributing editor at City Journal. Excited to have you. Steve Malenga, the George M. Yeager Fellow and Senior Editor at City Journal. And last but certainly not least, Ralph Mangual, Senior Fellow, Deputy Director of Legal Policy and Contributing Editor at City Journal. It's good to be with you all. Nicole, let's start with you. Let's ask the really big picture question. What are the biggest challenges still facing New York City right now, in your mind?
Well, the biggest challenge is that the white-collar workforce, both the employers and the employees, have now gone 13 months with 90% of the white-collar staff working away from the dense office districts, whether it's Midtown Manhattan or Lower Manhattan. You know, in a normal pre-pandemic day, almost 4 million people would come to the island of Manhattan every day and go home at the end of the day, whether they go to Queens, whether they go to Long Island, whether they go to Westchester or Connecticut. And substantially all of that activity has stopped. So never before in the history of the city since we transitioned to being a more white-collar dependent economy rather than a factory-based economy in the 1950s and 1960s, have workers and their employers demonstrated that they do not need to be on the island of Manhattan. Are they as productive as home? Probably not. Are they miserable sitting in their living rooms and bedrooms and kitchens, days on end? Probably, but they have proven that they can do it. So there is an unprecedented change in who has the power in terms of being able to set tax rates, being able to assess the quality of life, being able to assess the quality of commute, that we do now know that there is a certain threshold of pain beyond which employers don't have to be in Manhattan. And that threshold has certainly moved over the past year.
Now, Nicole, you, correct me if I'm wrong, you resided in Midtown Broadway, and I wonder how much of your perspective of the challenges, is informed by just seeing the empty streets of Midtown. How much should really New Yorkers worry about Midtown being so empty as it is? If maybe in their neighborhoods in the outer boroughs, street life appears to come back. A lot of shops seem to be doing pretty well. How should we weigh the different New Yorks that exist in this very large city?
Yeah, absolutely, Michael. And it's true that outer borough neighborhoods, no matter what their income status or their demographic makeup, if you go out to Coney Island, if you go out to Fordham Road in the Bronx, things look pretty normal, except for the fact that most people are wearing a mask. But I think the normality is a little bit of an illusion. When you think about poorer neighborhoods, for example, the only reason that people continue to spend money in their neighborhoods, continue to be active on the streets, is the extraordinary federal relief packages that were passed both during the Trump administration and now during the Biden administration, in terms of extended unemployment that substantially replaces most people's income if they're making below $75,000 a year. So if you're one of the nearly 650,000 New Yorkers who still are out of work, if you're in the hospitality sector, anything to do with tourism, a lot of white collar support jobs, not, cleaning offices and so forth, not coming back to Midtown, you have been held harmless economically. But at some point, that federal aid is going to run out. And that's where, if we do not figure out a way to bring those jobs back, that people in neighborhoods will really start suffering. And also in the upper income neighborhoods, people, chose to live in Williamsburg, in Greenpoint, in Long Island City, in Bushwick, partly because of the proximity to Manhattan. And so they're still there now, but the longer it goes on where people don't have to come into Manhattan for their job, do they look around and say, I'm paying a lot of rent for not so great housing quality, and I don't have to go to my office 5 days a week anymore. I don't even have to go 3 days a week. So can I replicate this elsewhere at a cheaper cost, someplace like Austin or Charlotte? So we're not in a horrible position right now, but things are kind of frozen. If they unfreeze in the wrong direction, it won't work out very well. But I know we're here to talk about how we can unfreeze things in the right direction.
Well, Nicole, that's great. Let's put a pin in that kind of frozen, illusory nature of New York's current state due to the federal government's role, because I think it's a great setup for Steve. But Ralph, I wanted to turn to you. Do you feel like, what has the past year revealed to you on policing and public safety? This is a big part of what you're working on. You're working on a book on this subject right now. Do you feel like we've taken public safety for granted? And I mean, was this past year kind of a revelation that we did, or do you think that this was just kind of a one-off blip? What's your take?
No, I do think that we've been taking public safety for granted, and it hasn't just been the last year. This has been something that I've been talking about, for at least a couple of years now. as much as we've succeeded on the crime front over the course of the 1990s and early 2000s, we just, I think have witnessed in 2020 how quickly that success can be eroded in a very short period of time. I mean, just to kind of analogize to something in our daily lives. I mean, I'm coming off of a physical injury. I had surgery where my arm was in a splint for 6 weeks. Now, before that, I was pretty good about going to the gym and was in shape, and all that progress of working out for years went away in that 6 weeks. When that splint came off, my arm was about half the size of my right arm. And I think that's what we're seeing in the public safety space. As hard as the work was to get crime and disorder under control in New York City, if we let off the gas even just a little bit, I think what we saw in 2020 is that things can turn around very, very quickly.
Yeah, so just to press on that a little bit more, that's a very helpful perspective. What do you hear from the police rank and file? What are folks in NYPD saying about this?
Oh, I think they are feeling beleaguered right now. I mean, it's interesting because they're kind of in a place in which their identity has been built around for years, this mission of crime fighting. This is how they see their careers, their life's work. And the thing that they've always understood themselves to be fighting against is moving in the wrong direction. But at the same time, they are getting a message from the public that basically amounts to a message to police that all the things that worked in the past to keep crime under control, to get to the city to the place that it was at just a couple years ago, should be abandoned. They are getting the message that they should stop, that all of the success that we've been enjoying through the 2000s, it is the product of a rotten tree. And so I think that makes them feel beleaguered. I also think they're feeling just emotionally deflated because, there's just been this incredible rise in anti-police rhetoric, not just, here in the city, but around the country, that just seems to be piling up on the shoulders of the rank and file. And when I talk to these cops, I think, one of the things that's really common is that they all communicate a real sense of fear. Not just necessarily fear of getting into a gunfight with a criminal, but fear that if they make an honest mistake in the field, or even if they don't make a mistake, even if they engage in a completely rational and defensible use of force that just doesn't look good on camera, that they won't be given a fair shake, that the city doesn't have their back, that they will be thrown under the bus. In fact, that they have a target on their back, that there is a premium on prosecutions of police officers, that there is a premium of on exposing, expanding the legal exposure that police officers face when they work. And so what that does is it sends them the kind of message, it creates the sort of incentive in which they are more likely to start prioritizing risk minimization than proactivity. And that's something that we just have tons of data on. And what that data indicates is that if you do that, if you prioritize risk minimization over proactivity, you're going to end up seeing crime move in the wrong direction.
Risk minimization meaning what?
Meaning, lowering the number of contacts that they have that might evolve into, the kind of interaction that won't look good on camera, right? Why get out of my car and risk having to use force for this if, no one's asking me to? And that's not what we want police to be doing. What we want police to be doing is using the time in between 911 calls to actually try and suss out crime, to figure out, okay, what's this guy up to? And I don't think they're going to keep doing that for much longer if we raise the transaction cost of that.
Or even just getting to know the community and their neighbors. Sure. That also takes a lot of time and a lot of footwork. Just one other quick question. So you talk about fear among the rank and file NYPD. Do you sense any fear around public safety, quality of life among the populace, the people of New York?
100%. It's really kind of sad because, of course, New York City has seen its major crime numbers go in the wrong direction for a while now. We've seen homicides, just explode over the last year. In 2020, they were up 45%. That's the biggest year-over-year increase that the city has seen since at least the 1960s. Shootings were up almost 100%. But it's not necessarily those kinds of crimes that are driving the fear of everyday New Yorkers. It's the exposure to this just increased tension in public spaces that is largely a function of incivility and disorder. And what's interesting is if you go back and look at some of the studies on perceptions of crime, what you'll find is that incivility and public disorder are actually more closely related to the public's fear of crime than serious crime numbers are. And when people are taking the subways and they get into a car and there's a homeless person without a mask laid across an entire bench of seats, or someone comes on with a Bluetooth speaker blasting music, essentially challenging the entire car to tell them to turn it down, or when a mentally ill person rants and raves and acts violently, punching a wall or spitting on the train. All of these things send a signal to the public that, hey, these public spaces are not in anyone's control. There's no one around here to protect you, which means that you're at risk. And the more that they internalize that sense, the more they're going to pull back from those public spaces. And what Nicole brought up earlier was that they're going to have the option to do that as remote work becomes a more regular part of life. They don't have to put up with a subway commute. They don't have to put up with the homeless person setting up camp in the local bus stop. They can move and keep their jobs and basically keep their income and also increase their living space. And so these are risks that I don't think our leadership fully appreciate.
Well, and Ralph, you make a great point too, that it's not just the absolute levels or numbers of crime or absolute instances of homelessness and other forms of in kinds of public disorder, but it is the perception, it's the fear, it's the reality forming a certain impression of the city that can then change behavior, and maybe not for the best. That's just such a good distillation of some of the challenges that we face. Steve, I want to turn to you. All of you, I guess, including myself, we've all written briefs for this mayoral playbook that are part of this New York City Reborn project. That's why I wanted us all to get together. And, I think all of us presented a series of proactive, positive policies for New York City's rebirth. It's a fundamental belief in the city. But Steve, I feel like we also have to start with the challenges. We have to start by saying, like, there is a need for reform in the first place. So starting off on that kind of somewhat less optimistic foot, Steve, what do you feel like we've taken, similar to public safety, do you feel like we've taken growth for granted over these past handful of years? You wrote a brief on the city's budget and finances that inevitably involves a look at the city's growth. How do you perceive that over the past handful of years?
See, it's first of all, I don't think people realize the extent to which we have taken growth for granted. And it's not just over the last 10 years, it's over the last 30 years. Let's get a little bit of history. If we go way back to the 1960s, New York City spent, even to the mid-50s, almost 40 years in a boom and bust cycle in which its economy essentially never really grew. I mean, it would grow and then it would go through a recession and then just collapse back and then grow and collapse back. That persisted until about the early 1990s. And as someone who was writing about some of this even back at that time, I really thought of New York's economy as basically just saturated, full. Then starting in the early 1990s, in the mid 1990s, New York City's economy began to grow. And even though there were recessions in that time, and even though it faced 9/11, which was almost like an existential crisis, despite all of that, the city actually saw real secular growth, to the point where between the early 1990s and really about 2016 or 17, New York City burst through the previous limitations, this previous ceiling, and added almost 1.5 million new jobs, which is really striking. That was about a 50% growth in jobs. Think about this. In 30 years, that was, for a city that was considered already large and essentially already at its ceiling, that was extraordinary. So extraordinary that people around the world, people in places like London and Paris, they talk to me about that and say how extraordinary this was. Now, with this came, of course, tremendous growth in the city tax revenues and the city's population. it brought with it lots of challenges, but it also brought with it lots of money to deal with those challenges. What we've seen since then is a new kind of crisis. And it's a crisis not just about New York City, although there are many things that are particular to New York City, but also a crisis that just is a crisis for all cities that are dense, that have the kind of office workforces that New York City has, the kind of workforce that can do something remotely. And it is also a crisis of the social order, because if you go back to this, this kind of these two cycles that I've talked about, the one from the 60s through the 90s, and then from the 90s to now, the one thing that characterized both of those cycles is there was a tremendous decline in the city's social order, a tremendous rise in disorder that accompanied the economic stagnation of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And then we saw a tremendous change in the city's social order starting in the 90s, almost continuously through that period, even though in the middle of it there was 9/11, which was just such an upsetting of the social order. Even though, and New York City was able to reestablish itself, and crime actually, despite the fact that the police in the aftermath of 9/11, that the police were so, public safety in general was so intensely focused on things like what happened down in Lower Manhattan. Despite that, crime remained extremely low. And so what you had is changes in the social order that accompanied that economic expansion and that hypercharged that economic expansion. Now we face something possibly completely different, a new order where workers may not have to work in the city, where a substantial portion of the population exited the city, either we don't know if it's temporarily at this point or not, and where the social order is again declining. And so we have tremendous questions based on all of that.
Steve, there's so much there. You gave an excellent history, gives us a sense of the future. I want to ask you one follow-up question, and then I'm going to get to some of the audience's questions. Keep them coming. A lot of good questions there. Steve, just quickly go back to something that Nicole raised. She suggested that that the federal aid, we should look at the federal aid that came to New York City this past year and the year before that as kind of almost being, there's two sides to it. So one is that it certainly papered over the enormous deficits that New York City, the MTA, the state were facing. But also that we should look clearly about the maybe potential for missed opportunities for reform. How do you look at federal aid? Is it going to help or hurt our long-term fiscal challenges?
Well, I don't think it can hurt our long-term challenges, although we can be deceived by it into believing that it's solving our problems. The thing is, and this puts it into context, the New York City is probably going to gain about $6 billion in aid. Plus, of course, the money that's going to the state budget will help the state continue to fund its share of the city's budget. So that's enormous. However, some of the projected deficits, and it's very hard to be accurate about this right now because we don't know what happens next here, more so than any other time, except maybe after 9/11. We don't know what happens next. But the projected deficits over the next 3 or 4 years are like maybe $15 billion. So even the government, the federal money isn't enough. Some of it is targeted. We can only use it in some ways. And money is fungible. You can move it around. But even outside of that, the projected deficits are big enough that they could be twice what the federal government sent to us, which means, and this is a real problem, is that as the city is trying to recover over the next 3 or 4 years, and maybe it's going to take that long, even just for people's attitudes to change back again, for people to start doing things, not just New Yorkers doing things, but people around the world coming here, for instance, because tourism was such an enormous part of the city's economy. We face budget challenges that even the federal stimulus doesn't really begin to solve.
So there's one question here from Anna. She asked a good question. To rebirth something, and the title of all of this is New York City Reborn. To rebirth something, doesn't that require seeds and water to grow it? So she asked, what seeds, I'm asking this to you, Steve, what seeds is the city are the city planting, and how are they watering it? So I guess another way to ask this too is to say that, we can look back to previous crises for New York City. Let's say 9/11. The city faced enormous challenges then, and still did in a handful of years after 9/11. Mayor Bloomberg comes along, proposes new spending. Maybe it would have been reasonable to say then, look, we're only just now coming out of a crisis. You're proposing new spending. Do we have the ingredients for growth? Of course, in the years since then, New York City boomed in many respects and increasingly diversified. What do you see any similar seeds being planted now, or is that part of what worries you?
Yes, it is part of what worries me. First of all, the thing about 9/11 is it was actually somewhat direct. What were the seeds we needed to plant? We need to clear downtown. We needed to rebuild down there. Tell the world that we're rebuilding down there. And by the way, we need to tell the rest of the world, and this was what Bloomberg did say right after being elected, New York City is open for business. Do not believe New York City is closed for business. We're open for business, and let's get on with it. And since the city had a decade of growth before that, those are pretty strong messages. Right now, part of what's going on is the notion everybody has a different notion of how you rebuild. If you listen to the mayoral campaign, for instance, a lot of that discussion is about things that actually go against what were the foundation of the city's revival even after 9/11. Again, I said this before, but it's hard to underestimate this. There was so much fear after 9/11, or so much uncertainty after 9/11, but the city never exploded. We never had violence. Crime continued to be extremely low during that period of time. That was such a stabilizing factor, and everybody bought into the idea that that was important. Now we have a completely different narrative. We've gone through a pandemic that created a similar kind of fear as we felt after 9/11, like almost an unseen threat, if you would. We saw the results, but we didn't know where it was coming from. We have something similar now, but we have a completely different discourse about that. Such a different discourse that a lot of our business leaders are worried about exactly where the city is going. The other thing that is so different is that, and this is almost a generational change, is that we have a leadership now, and I think both in Albany and in the city council, that has become so far left that they are disconnected from the business community. If you think of the kind of what happened to save New York City in the 70s, the business community was highly, highly involved in that. They felt they had a real stake in that. In the aftermath of 9/11, they were a big part. They felt they had a voice there and they were listened to. I think that right now, one of the big threats is the business community. They feel almost disconnected from the politics of the city right now. So we're looking at this tremendous task to revive the city in the midst of all this. And it's like the business community feels a little bit like an afterthought.
Now, Nicole, I want to ask you a question from the audience. It's a little bit off of what you've written on your brief, but I know that you have opinions on this. So, we're getting new taxes coming into New York City. There's a pied-à-terre tax that's been discussed. There's the increase in the top tax rate for high earners, turning New York City into the highest tax jurisdiction in America for those who are the most well off. In one sense, you could say that it just takes a progressive tax system, makes it a little bit more progressive. It's maybe it won't actually adjust the behavior of that many people. If the SALT tax cap is removed, maybe New York becomes a little more competitive. But there's obviously a counter narrative and a counter argument. Nicole, what do you think is going to be the impact of some of these new taxes being levied on New York City?
I don't think this was the right time to raise taxes, and I would echo some of what Steve was saying. I mean, the state legislature just raised the top marginal tax rate by 24%. That is a significant tax increase. And these are the people, whether it's the three thresholds of people making over $25 million a year, people making $5 to $10 million a year, and then people making over $1 million a year. These are the people who are the most mobile. and the people who employ people. So they are not only making decisions for where they choose to live full time, but in some cases where their employees choose to live full time. If you are running a tech firm or a financial firm in New York City, decide to open a satellite office in Florida, in Arizona, in Connecticut, in Texas, employees who do not live in New York City or New York State can say that they work from that satellite office and avoid these out-of-state taxes that they've been paying. So, again, at a time when people have demonstrated that they don't need to be in the highest cost dense office center in the country, it is not a good time to call their bluff and say, okay, we're going to raise taxes because every time we've raised taxes in the past, people have said the rich will flee, and the rich have never fled. I mean, sometimes it is true that this time is different, and this may be one of those times that this time is different. And I also, I was interested in also what Steve was saying about how we didn't really see social breakdown and an increase in crime after 9/11. New York really did come together. And some of these arguments that people make today about crime during the pandemic, they could have gone the other way. I mean, if the murder rate were down 40% right now rather than up 40%, if the police department tried to take credit for the murder rate being down 40%, people would say, well, of course the murder rate is down. It's a pandemic. People are home. They're worried about their health. They're not going to be out committing crime. So we shouldn't take it for granted like the mayor does. The Mayor de Blasio says, this is a perfect storm. There's nothing we could have done about crime going up. But we shouldn't take it for granted that this was the way that it had to play out. If it played out the other way, which it very well might have 15, 20 years ago, people would take that for granted. So I think there's a real change in our expectations that we should be a little bit nervous about.
Well, and it is remarkable that over the past handful of years, New York City has seen a net departure of high earners. The only reason why the overall number hasn't markedly declined is because New York City was creating a lot of new high earners too. And it's questionable whether or to what degree that can continue into the future. It also seems remarkable that we're making these big, tax and spending decisions precisely at the moment when companies, individuals are making big decisions about where they want to live, how they want to live, where they want to site their offices. This is a moment for decision. And I think we're seeing what Albany and City Hall are deciding. So, all right, so to pivot our discussion, so we've been clear about the challenges. I want to get to a discussion on the city that we want to see. So Nicole, I'll stay with you and then I'll get to you, Ralph. Nicole, you wrote a brief on the city's transportation and infrastructure. So give us a sense of what your top policy priorities are coming out of this crisis for transportation infrastructure, because that is absolutely essential to a flourishing New York City, I would argue.
Yeah, the number one policy priority is that we need to get people back on mass transit. There's no way around it. Of course, we want to encourage people to bicycle. We want to encourage people to walk more. Ferries are fine. But the reality is that before the pandemic, the subways used to move 5.5 million people a day. Of everyone who came into Manhattan on an average day, more than 60% came in by subway alone. So we cannot rebuild a dense city until we get people comfortable riding the subways on a daily basis again. I think one issue is the crime on the subways. The MTA did a survey the last couple of weeks that said people are actually more worried about crime on the subways than they are about the pandemic. So making it clear that we will secure the fare gate, we won't let people jump over the turnstiles and then go on to commit bigger crimes in the subway system. These incidents of pushings and assaults into subways, making it clear that we won't tolerate that. These are all important aspects of getting people back on mass transit. And I think the second thing is just much better management of the streetscape itself. It's clear that people like outdoor dining. You know, when Anna referred to what are the seeds that we're planting, I think that's one of them, that the outdoor dining has improved, you know, what the quality of life for New Yorkers. It feels a little bit more like a European city. So we need more space for restaurants out on the sidewalks and streets. But at the same time, we need more space for bicyclists. I mean, the only form of organized transportation that has regained its pre-pandemic levels is city bike. I mean, city bike ridership last summer and fall actually well above the pre-pandemic summer and fall numbers. And the city controller just came out with a number today. This March compared to March of 2019, bicycle trips over the East River were actually up 38%. So we need more room for cyclists. The bike lanes are too narrow. There's not enough of them. And this just goes to the issue that we need a mayor who walks around on the streets regularly, sees what's going on that's right with them, sees what's wrong with them, and approaches this in a much more systemic way. We also want the commute to be consistent and predictable for people who choose to drive in. Now, that's not going to be a lot of people, but it will still be some people. And so as we think about implementing congestion pricing, what should drivers be able to expect? They shouldn't have a system or lack of a system where there's potholes everywhere, where they don't know whether they can drive on a certain road or not. So we need consistent, predictable rules of the road for everybody, which we haven't had.
Yeah, it is remarkable how much, just to give one other quick follow-up, how much it mattered, just the symbolism of what a mayor did with his or her time as they commuted, how they commuted. And the fact that, you know, Mayor de Blasio mainly just used vehicle transportation, used the roads, didn't really ride the subways, you know, that told you something about his view of the city's transportation network, what he valued, what he prioritized. Have you been encouraged or disappointed by what you've seen any of the mayoral candidates propose in this regard, or maybe what they've done symbolically?
Yeah, I think the good thing is that the idea of bike lanes or pedestrian plazas is no longer a radical idea. I mean, when Mayor Bloomberg started doing some of these things in 2008, 2009, people, not a lot of people, but a reasonable plurality of people said, this is crazy. We can't have a bike lane on 8th or 9th Avenue. We can't pedestrianize part of Times Square. Even Mayor de Blasio, when he ran in 2013, said he would rethink the pedestrian plazas. And I think, except for a couple fringe candidates, I don't think anyone would argue those things today. I mean, most of the mayoral candidates have basic plans of more bus lanes, more protected bike lanes. But I think where they'll distinguish themselves is, can they actually manage this on a day-to-day basis? So you want someone who has had real executive experience in getting tough projects accomplished. So, you would look at someone like Ray McGuire, who's managed a big team of people. You would look at someone like Catherine Garcia, who managed the city's Department of Sanitation, made sure that the garbage was picked up every day. And of course, those are not the only two. I encourage everyone to look through the slate of candidates and think for themselves, who here is a good, solid manager, that it's not just their ideas that matter, but can they get them accomplished? Right,
Ralph, I want to turn to you. Similar question to you. You wrote a brief with our colleague Hannah Myers, who is director of the Policing Public Safety Initiative at Manhattan Institute, on the top priorities for the next mayor. So give us a sense of what those top priorities are, and if you're seeing any encouragement from what the mayoral candidates are also saying.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think everyone on this panel and everyone in the city wants to see New York get back to a place in which people feel safe, in which middle-class families think that they can see themselves raising a family within the 5 boroughs. And I think in order to do that, what the next mayor is going to need to prioritize is crime. You can't do it without crime. I mean, just to go back to an earlier question, about the seeds and watering them, and how New York City needs to do that. Plants also need sunlight to grow, and the problem with crime and disorder is that it casts a very, very dark shadow over a society. And I think we've lost sight of the fact that getting crime and disorder under control is a prerequisite to economic success and economic growth. And so, how we do that, I think, is going to take a lot of things. The top 4 priorities that we highlighted in our brief was, number one, to reinforce the ranks of the NYPD. I mean, a lot of people may not know this, but just in 2020, the NYPD decreased in size by 7%. Police departments around the country have been having lots of problems with recruitment and retention. The NYPD has now seen that it's not exempt from that, and those problems, were only exacerbated by the pressure to defund the department. There was a budget cut passed last summer that required the NYPD to eliminate an entire academy class that would have replaced some of the officers that were lost. I mean, and another thing to remember is that a lot of police officers, not just here in New York, but around the country, were hired as a result of the federal investment in policing in the mid-90s. Those police officers are now at the point in their careers where they are eligible for retirement. So I think we're going to see a lot more retirement. And if we cannot replace those ranks with people who are quality candidates, who are highly educated, psychologically stable, patient people who are motivated for public service, then I think the city is going to run into a problem. So I think the next mayor needs to start there. That's certainly priority number one. Number two is, I think the next administration needs to recommit to a community policing plan that doesn't just focus on serious crime, but also prioritizes disorder. We've already talked about sort of the relationship between disorder and perceptions of crime. It is just so unbelievably important. And it's something that New Yorkers consistently, when asked, report that they want prioritized. And so, the more that kind of effort is put off, the more current New Yorkers, especially those who aren't originally from here, will be incentivized to try and consider other places to live. I also think the city needs to work more diligently to address, some of the misconceptions that are feeding the legal cynicism that underlies a lot of the harsh criticism of police and criminal justice. And finally, tying into some of the things that Nicole has talked about, I think the city needs to revamp its approach to serious mental illness, and it has to do that by emphasizing more and better supervision, so that police aren't constantly, being called to address people who are in crisis in public spaces, often just to have those people released from a hospital a few hours later.
Yeah, and this is I think a really important point to say that there is a perception, a negative perception of some of the policies that have been instituted for policing public safety over the past generation or two. But there's also a demand for just safety, and there is a demand to not have your children shot in the streets or to feel threatened as you walk from home, and that you need to both address those fears, disparities that are observed, address those legitimately, and face them head on, but also to listen to the community on what they're asking for and what they would like to see in terms of a police presence, to make sure that their kids and their families and themselves are indeed safe. Steve, I want to turn to you. What are your top priorities for the city, especially when it comes to finance? So, you'd raise the point that the dollars that are coming in from DC, those really did address a lot of these short-term needs of the city, but that over the medium term, maybe over the long term, there's still a lot of potential deficits that we face, maybe in terms of healthcare, maybe pensions, others, that will still have to be addressed. Those haven't gone away. So what would be your kind of top messages and top priorities for the city's next mayor when it comes to finance?
Well, to understand this simply, in this period of tremendous expansion that I've talked about, especially in the last 10 years, New York spent most of the money that it was taking in expansion. It had very little in reserve, so little in reserve that essentially what happened is when this pandemic struck, The city was doing things like taking money out of health savings accounts that are supposed to be savings for the next 30 years. So the city is basically, the city's budget has grown along with the economy with very little in reserve. And the thing about cities and local governments in particular is their budgets are made of people money. About 50% of New York's budget is just to salaries and workers. The de Blasio administration gave us an unprecedented rise in the size of the city's workforce, added 30,000 people. At the same time that was going on, what happened was we were increasing the cost of what we paid people. To just give you an idea, the cost of employing an average New York City worker right now, just the average worker, counting all kinds of compensation, including benefits, is $151,000 per worker. We added 30,000 workers. Somebody get out your calculator and just do what that cost alone is added to the city budget. More important than that is it's unclear what we got for a lot of that. Particularly, a lot of these workers were added for programs that were unproven, if you will. The mayor's mental health initiative, which turned out to be kind of a fuzzy emphasis on people who felt a little bit not right. It wasn't really a kind of a very structured program looking at the problem that we have with mental health with people on the streets in New York. A lot of these programs are unproven. The next mayor is going to have to come in and say, number one, we have to cut the cost of employment in New York City, which is very hard to do because once you add those costs, the politics of it are very hard to cut. We'll probably have to reduce the size of the city's workforce. We actually have room to do that in a bunch of areas, except ironically in places like policing, where we are reducing the workforce, and we shouldn't be reducing the workforce. The thing is, though, that I guess you could say that some of this is low-hanging fruit insofar as we expand it so much that the opportunities to cut are right there, except for the fact that New York City laws, and more importantly, New York State laws, make it very difficult to do things like cut people costs once you incur them in the city, which is another reason why you need to be careful about that. And the next thing we need to do is once we hit hopefully a new era of affluence, if you will, we need to save some of that money because New York City has the highest debt per individual, per capita, not just overall debt because we're a big city. Of any city in America, we owe $100 billion in promises we've made to retirees just for their health care in the future, not for pensions. That's just for health care. The city's debt services, debt requirements for paying off his debt, they're growing every year so that more and more of the budget is not going for actual people costs so that we can do things now to make the city better. It's going to pay off legacy costs. And that's a really bad formula. And the next mayor has to really attack that.
One of the things that I think caught people unawares during the pandemic was how when the crisis hit and the budget for the city seemed to be in dire straits, one of the first things that Mayor de Blasio reached to cut was trash pickup. I'd also add parks to that.
Services.
Thought, why would you cut those services? Especially like, maybe it's harder to spread COVID-19 outdoors. You want to go to a park. Why would you reduce the quality of the parks right when it's most necessary? And so it seems like, if the response to what you're saying, Steve, if the critical response is, well, why are we talking about cutting essential services when so many people, why are you talking about cutting city spending when so many people in New York City are in need? Perhaps the response to that is because we fear a crowd out of all the other essential things that New York City does. And, I wonder how you envision, Steve, a city that, both keeps its promises, that, does its job in terms of essential services while being fiscally sustainable. Is there a way to kind of have your cake and eat it too? When it comes to the city?
Part of what you're talking about, having to, when you have to cut in an emergency, having to cut into essential services goes to what I was saying about how difficult it is politically to deal with these issues. If you look, forget about the city, think about the entire country and the entire economy. When we had this tremendous just decline and slowdown in economic activity, what did companies do? What did employers do? So listen, no raises this year. Listen, we're going to put less into your 401k this year. Listen, we're going to actually have to reduce, you're going to have to contribute more to your health care. None of those things, which every employer probably around the country is doing, none of those things is possible to do in New York City. You can't say in an emergency, I'm sorry, this year we're going to have to cancel those raises that are in your contract. We're going to have to actually cut compensation by 3%. You can't do any of that. And that is so instead, what do? Right? The only way to save people costs in an emergency in New York is to fire people. And if you start firing people immediately, you're cutting into services. So what do? We cut real services, even while we are spending more in compensation, probably than any large city in America. And we could not cut into those things, keep the workforce, keep the services, and make those cuts rationally, even though that's what virtually every employer in America was being forced to do. And that has to do with the politics. It has to do with legislation that has been passed in Albany that makes it impossible to do those kinds of things. So instead, what do? You cut people's trash collection.
Right. So if the charge is, well, you're proposing an austerity budget, perhaps the response then to that is, no, you're proposing a resilient budget, something that when crisis hits can ensure that people do get the services that they need, that the city can be on a sound footing when crisis does come, but then also take advantage of growth when or if, hopefully, fingers crossed, it does return in a meaningful way. In the time that we have, Nicole, I want to get back to you. Your proposal, your ideas were on infrastructure and transportation for this mayoral playbook. You detailed some of the specifics that you wanted, but thinking really big picture, what is the city you want to see? When you dream of the future and you take this opportunity for reset, if you consider it that way, this opportunity for reset that came with the pandemic, what is your hope, dream, and vision that you would love to see for the city, especially when it comes to transportation infrastructure?
Yeah, I think the first thing has to be public safety. That I echo Ralph, that without people in every single New York City neighborhood being able to feel like their kids can go outside on a hot day or go to the playground and not have to worry about getting in a dispute and having a tragedy happen, I think that's the most important thing. My vision for the city is that people don't lock themselves away in gated communities and say, well, I live in a nice neighborhood, I can eat brunch in my neighborhood and there's no crime in my neighborhood, so I'm not going to worry about what happens in neighborhoods where shootings have more than doubled. And I think transportation is what makes us one city, because the density of New York City means that in the past, people have not been able to fully insulate themselves from the effects of crime. We're not like Palm Beach, where you can live behind a gate and protect yourself. I mean, back in the 1980s and early 1990s, if you lived on the Upper East Side, you did have to worry in taking a walk that you would be at risk of a crime, or letting your kid go walk the dog. You would have to worry about such a thing. And so that's why we had one city that was focused on bringing violent crime down and also improving the quality of life. It is in New York City's best interest for the wealthy not to be able to insulate themselves from these problems. But the issue right now is that if we are not able to address these issues in a constructive way, people will insulate themselves simply by moving away. You want a subway system where everyone feels safe riding the subway. If we don't have that, it just becomes a transportation system for poorer and working class people who have no other choice. And that has never been the New York that we want to live in.
Well, the thing is, this is not fantasy. many New Yorkers have lived through historically low rates of crime and have, seen a subway system that had bounced back considerably from some of its darkest days. So this vision of recovery and of safety is not unheard of. And so it's really, Nicole, I wonder if you would agree with this, is really about ensuring we don't reverse those gains, but we build on what we've done in the past, continue to build on that, and improve things going forward, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And on that note, I know one of our audience members asked about books to recommend. I would recommend The Ungovernable City by Vincent Canado, because it talks about the Lindsay years, some of the labor unrest, some of the social unrest that we saw back then, and how a lot of people said, well, there's nothing we can do about it. This is just the way things are. New York is ungovernable. And also, ladies and gentlemen, The Bronx Is Burning, another book that chronicles the late 1970s in New York and people just taking for granted that this is the way things are.
It's great. Ralph, I want to turn to you. Similar question. We heard your specific policy ideas. What are you envisioning for the future of New York City? What do you wish your kids will be able to grow up in over the next handful of years?
Yeah, I mean, I got to echo Nicole's sentiments here. I mean, especially having become a parent, in the last 2 years, it's, the number one priority has shifted to, safety, security, opportunity. I want to see a New York in which not just wealthy families who can kind of afford to pay the premium to insulate themselves from the city's problems, but middle-class families can live within the 5 boroughs with just as much confidence as wealthier families, that their kids will not be victimized, that they'll get a good education, etc. And so, that just has to start with a priority on public safety. And the problem with where the city is headed, I think, is that the city's current leadership and those vying to be the city's next leaders have kind of redirected all of their attention to the reform question in response to legitimate concerns. Let's be clear about that. But in doing so, they have lost sight of their number one mission, which is to provide that level of safety for families so that they can stay here. And that is more important now than ever. It's discouraging as a lifelong New Yorker, to see people for the first time consider a life outside the 5 boroughs. It's not something I ever thought I would think of. And so, when you ask me what I envision New York getting back to the place or where everyone wants to be here, where this is the sort of prime time stage. I think our city's leaders are taking for granted its position in the hierarchy, and we can start to drop off quite quickly.
That's a great summary, Steve. I wanted to quickly turn to you because you I think have ideas too on books to read. This is actually a good way to conclude our conversation. Craig in the audience asked a great question about books to read about the history of New York to be able to better understand its future. Steve, I know you have some great recommendations too.
Yes, along the lines of reading about both the fiscal crisis of the 60s and the 70s, certainly the Canonado book but also The Cost of Good Intentions by Robert Morse, I think it is, or James Morse. The Cost of Good Intentions, which is about how the city got into trouble during that era in terms of just spending way beyond its means on programs that essentially not only it couldn't afford, but weren't doing any good. Also, though, Fred Siegel, who's an MI scholar, his book on Giuliani, The Prince of the City, which is about how the city began its comeback, is really essential to understand, I think. Also, to understand the 60s, William F. Buckley's book, The Unmaking of a Mayor, about John Lindsay, is just it's a frightening but hilarious read. Buckley, of course, ran against Lindsay. It's a fascinating document of that era. I would also recommend that.
And many of the conversations that you saw back then, you begin to see reappearing now. It's fascinating. And then, of course, to anyone watching, you have to read the book that's in everybody's New York City Zoom background, The Power Broker. Nicole, I know you just led a conversation on that in Clubhouse the other day. Look, this has been a terrific conversation. Nicole, Steve, Ralph, thank you so much for being a part of it. I believe this is all the time we have. To learn more, so for everybody tuning in, to learn more about MI's New York City Reborn initiative and to read our policy playbook for the next mayor, there should be some links on the screen. Please click on them. But also, if you're tuning in, please don't leave. Next up, we have Jeff Colton, the senior reporter for City and State, here to join us for discussion on from campaigns to COVID to City Hall, reporting on the race for New York City's next mayor. Please stay tuned.